be epic. But it's been edited.
Well, I also, it's interesting what we're talking about, because I like the many worlds theories. You know, the idea that everything coexists on the same plane, yet in different dimensions. And that's something that's interesting about epic fantasy, because you could say that this is a world that is like our world, but is completely different and is in another dimension, yet it has some of the hallmarks of our world.
And the problem is with this, like I said, my particular little, I'll call my theory kind of crackpot, whereas yours I don't doubt is footnoted and stuff.
I was talking out of my...
She is winging it.
But once you start thinking, ooh, two worlds, it's really, you start going, ooh, this. But really, like Alice in Wonderland, this is not happening. These are not two worlds. It's one world and a dream exists in this mundane world. However, Narnia does become one, except there you have the fantastic world, and the thing that's intruding is the mundane into the fantastic world. And so you get this strange inversion. But if you go back and you look at so many of the very popular stories that have lasted for dozens and dozens or hundreds of years, they are, my favorite Shakespeare is Midsummer Night's Dream, you know? And there you get fey, real, viciously interacting. That's the heart of the story.
So we talked about a lot of the tropes of the genre there: monsters, magic, new worlds, the epic size of the books. Are there any other tropes that come to mind? And then, why do you think the audience, that would be like your fans that are here, why do they react so well to these particular tropes? What is it that really excites them and engages them, especially right now at this particular time?
I think it's just the idea that you could go around the corner and bump into something completely unusual. I mean, I walk down the street every single day, but on Thursday I hit a troll.
For those creepy things that you see out of the corner of your eye.
Exactly.
And, where did I put my keys? They were here just a second ago. That's one of the cool things about urban fantasy, is taking those weird moments that you have in real life and saying, but really, it was a goblin.
Yeah.
And after he got your keys, he went to your car, and then the bad stuff happened.
Written urban fantasy started getting more popular as horror movies started getting dumber. And I'm serious. You can make charts. And that's because for a while that kind of story was being covered for us by the horror cinema, by the Twilight Zone, by that sort of thing, because they were giving you the story where you turned your car down the street and you bumped into a troll.
Right.
And it gave people things to think about during a time when epic fantasy was dominating the shelves. And then our horror movies started to degrade a little bit due to improved special effects requiring less in the way of script. And so, people got to watching the epic things happen on screens, and they didn't need to read about it, but they didn't have those things presented to them in any other form. So in written form, they started to take off. We've always wanted those stories. We just change how we present them every couple of generations.
So that explains why a lot of urban fantasy is actually shelved in horror in a lot of bookstores. I asked a manager once why he did that, and he said, because vampires are horrible. And I said, what about Charlene Harris? And he said, well, they're still vampires.
Were they in the same area? Were they in horror?
Oh,
too?
yeah.
Oh, they were. Okay.
If it had a vampire in it, it was in horror. And it seems to me that is actually one of the things that we see a lot in urban fantasy and less in epic, in what we tend to consider high fantasy or epic fantasy, is the intrusion of what we normally think of as the horror creatures, the vampires, the werewolves, the monsters, the necromancers, the witches, and less of the mild, or we would think of them as mild creatures like fairies and elves, although, we know they're not exactly nice. So we're in horror.
Which is fine. I don't mind it.
I love horror.
Well, I think
Harry Potter? In the
in the Harry Potter section.
Behind glass with a mallet that says break in case of boredom.
Witches in that.
in the best-selling section.
I figured you go with horror.
Best-selling and young adult.
Young
adult is a genre all of its own.
No, it's not.
Do you guys think different panels?
It is the truth. young adult has become a genre that is desirable to be in because it sells better than fantasy. I mean, this is just kind of the truth. New York Times now tracks young adult as a separate thing. Why did that happen? Because people were pissed that Harry Potter would hunker down on that #1 spot for 2 months, and none of their books could get any press. This is a marketing issue.
Series books separately from standalone books.
Yeah.
So if you're writing in a series, and if book 1 hits the New York Times list, that's cool. It can be a YA #1 bestseller. But when book 2 hits, it goes in the YA series category, which is much more competitive.
Yeah. And I think that's the other reason sometimes things get shelved in horror, because horror, again, it sells better than straight up sci-fi fantasy, typically, as a whole. And so those marketing considerations end up being kind of fickle. It's not, what is this? Which is an important question, but that's a very literary question, as opposed to, what will sell this? Which is a little grubbier question, but it's still a really important one.
Ooh, we all get to be Stephen King now.
I just was wondering what you guys, and you guys too, thought about the idea that maybe the reason urban fantasy became so popular is because we were living in a very conservative, you know, our politically in this country we were more toward the right, and I think the urban fantasy is our world, yet with all these fantastical elements, so it appeals to us because it's the world maybe we want to live in. It's an escape, but it's also, it's an escape, but it's also what's appealing to us.
Well, and it takes things like I've forgotten the title, the children's books where you see trolls and, you know, you hold up a special gem and whatever, and you can see
Spiderweb.
Thank you, I couldn't remember. I've got an 8 and 10-year-old, so you can take time, you know. But, and it turns, and Jack of Kenrowan, you know, the Jack the Giant Killer and all that, is geared more to, I guess, the young adult and the adult, but I still read it every couple of years, because it is interesting, you know, turn your clothes inside out and the fairies can't see you and all this other stuff.
That's true, by the way.
And
It is true.
And, you know, you
That
look,
explains so much.
you drive down the street and you see a figure on the side of the road and you have to do a double take to see that it's a brick mailbox. It's not that thing you thought you saw standing there. But it's cool because it gives adults the ability to have that little childhood, you know, bit of just driving down the street.
And I think that's actually part of, I can hear myself in the mic. That's one of the things you were talking about. When you're kids, the doors of possibility are wide open, which means it's very easy to be frightened as a child because you don't know what may or may not be, and the unknown is always scary. And as you grow up, you kind of recognize that the world has a shape to it, you become more confident in knowing what's really out there, and then...
I was going to say, no. I don't see shadows in my closet.
And eventually you kind of get a feel for your place in the world, and while you may feel more confident and safe, at the same time you lose that corresponding, you know, wonder of the what if, you know, the belief that things might be out there. And I think that's what a big piece of what urban fantasy has to give. It tickles that part of us that used to find it very easy to believe in anything.
I don't want to lose that.
Afraid of believing in it anymore, that it's not socially appropriate anymore, but yet we're still, I mean, the human being is a question seeker. Even when we don't think we're doing that, we're still doing that. And as an adult, we do that less, but are we doing it less?
Well, and it's culturally, I mean, go into work and say, you know, I think there might really be vampires.
Exactly.
Yeah, see how quickly you get promoted.
So we can escape into fantasy.
Or New Orleans. You know, fantasy is that door, you know, you open the door, if you go in, that's high fantasy, that's epic fantasy. If it comes out, that's urban fantasy.
Oh, there you go. That's good.
Scary.
I like that.
It is scary.
That's scary.
The other thing that the urban fantasy does that relates somewhat to what you were saying about the political climate is it provides metaphors for far more controversial subjects.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
provides ways to talk about, you know, gay marriage or racism or whatever, where, you know, if you're talking about the racism against the vampires, then
Talking
then
about,
it's a lot easier to discuss that.
yeah, then the gay and
in an
lesbian
abstract.
issue of can we let them marry or not.
Yeah.
Same way animal characters.
Can werewolves and vampires really get married? Is that well? And actually, C.K. Chesterton said that way back in the day, and that was the old folktale issue.
Right.
You know, the purpose of these fairy tales is not to tell us there are dragons, but to tell us that Obama can get elected.
Oh, Chesterton did not say that.
Just kind of touch on one of the other interesting things about urban fantasy. It's the only genre that times out. Because there was a time when the fairy tales were the urban fantasies of their day. Those were places we lived. We lived in a little house, and there was a great big forest between us and Grandma, and then there was more forest between Grandma and the next person over. So those were urban fantasy when they were contemporary stories. But now we look at them and we say, oh, they're fantasy, they're fairy tales. In 200 years, you know, when our descendants are sentient slime mold living on the shelves of a ruined library, the idea of being bipeds.
What a nice view of the future.
You and Tom need to work together.
The idea of being bipeds, having this discussion is going to be like, really? Nuh-uh, that's crazy. And we'll be the epic fantasy. So urban fantasy has a perpetual timeout limit. Steampunk would have been urban fantasy 100 years ago, but now it's its own genre.
No, it was science fiction 100 years ago, back when Jules Verne was writing it.
You've kind of hit on something kind of interesting, talking about like young adult versus adult, and left and right, urban, Midwest. Like between epic fantasy and urban fantasy, is there a difference, do you think, in the segments of the audience out there that's interested in it? Is there a clear group of people that are, or many groups of people that respond differently to one genre versus the other?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
And why do you think that is?
They just like one thing, and one person likes like apples and oranges.
Does
I
it
really,
split on the gender divide too? Does it seem like, for me, it seems like urban fantasy is a more women's kind of literature.
No. That's something I object to very strongly.
Well,
is that it's been spun that way, and yet there are guys like Tom
That's true.
and Simon.
What did you mean by
You know, Anton.
Yeah, Anton,
Strout.
sure.
There are
Yeah,
lots
that's
of
true.
men
Yeah,
out there
yeah.
writing very male-oriented urban fantasy, and yet we keep hearing, oh, it's a girls' genre. It's not a girls' genre.
no.
Well, no, I will actually go along with that because, I mean, Tolkien, find me 3 women in The Lord of the Rings.
I was going to say, it's not so much that urban fantasy is
For women.
for women as that epic fantasy tends to be a lot more male-oriented.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're, as
That
much
makes
as we
sense.
might try to fight it or push against it, you know, Tolkien's shadow is very deep and it's very long.
Well, but then we have Jordan.
On the other hand, you got like Jim Butcher, who's doing
Right.
fantastic.
Yeah. But I think a lot more women are reading urban fantasy than are necessarily reading the epic fantasy.
Yes, that's what I was wondering.
At least in part because of what we were encouraged to read as kids, because that is when you're forming what you're going to want to grow up to read more of. And urban fantasy, I was allowed to read all I wanted, but I and most of my friends, if we picked up the epics, our parents would go, oh honey, that book's too long for you. And then we would slap the microphone, and then our parents would take our books away. And that was pretty prevalent in the town I lived in, was that we were not expected to be in the hard books section of the library.
Wow.
And
I never read anything that my grandkids are reading, or my kids read.
Mhm.
I mean, I never read Mark Twain. I never read any of it, just like
Well, there's also, epic also implies a massive journey, a long trek. And traditionally, you know, back when we're talking like Ulysses, those were undertaken by men.
Yeah.
And so it isn't until you start getting some of those much more feminist fantasy writers like Marion Zimmer Bradley, you know, writing about heroic women, that you start to see that mold getting broken. And they're still kind of the minority, don't you think?
Well, do you guys feel that I love Joseph Campbell's Through the Thousand Faces, The Hero's Journey.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, this is something that I've been going around and around about, in epic fantasy you see the hero's journey, it is there, you go on it. In urban fantasy I feel like a lot of times it's not so much the journey of getting to it's the character's already there and we're just, do you know what I mean? It's I don't feel like we don't see the get to. I feel like we're just in the middle of a battle, kind of.
Well, since the urban fantasy stuff has a tendency to be series books, you're going on the journey of each book. It's a little piece
Well, that's an
of the
interesting
journey
thing to
that
think
gets
about,
you to the big picture. Is
Oh,
you
I
hope
like
that
that.
you hope there's a big picture at the end. I hope there's a big picture at the end.
Yeah, I hope so.
I haven't thought of my big picture yet.
Yeah, I write in arcs. You know, I have this long arc, and then I'm going to start another one, and so on.
Yeah.
Do you guys do that?
I do too.
Well, I did too, but my publisher wouldn't.
I didn't realize I was doing that until about my 4th book.
Oh, really?
And then all of a sudden I realized, okay, the first actually the first 6 books in my series are going to all take place in 1 year.
Wow.
And I didn't even realize when I began, because also when you begin a series, you don't know how many books.
Right, you don't know if you're going to be allowed to go any further than that. Yeah, that's why I'm hoping that I will be allowed to tell my story. Yeah.
I'm just doing a straight up hero's journey. We've had the refutation and we've left the valley, and now I'm trying to find a map.
Do we have companions yet?
Well, in terms of tropes, I think that's a big one where in epic fantasy, there's usually a journey. In urban fantasy, I mean, where do you need to go? I mean, everything you need is already in New York.
The journey becomes internal rather than external.
Right. And I also think probably because of that, one of the things that pays the reader in an epic fantasy is different than urban fantasy. Epic fantasy is probably usually more, one of the things that you read for is the exploration of another world. And in some ways, I think that might make epic fantasy more universal than urban, because if you say, okay, you're in Seattle, but with werewolves. But some of us have been to Seattle and some of us haven't. Maybe some of us grew up in France. And so, like, for that person, Seattle is just the thought of coffee and the Space Needle. Whereas for other people, used to walk around there, you know, for 20 years out of their life. And so that means you have to walk a very weird line between people who know your area better than you and people who know nothing. Whereas, at least with me, while I have to build everything from the ground up, at least I know we're all starting on the same page. Ha ha.
You're totally right, because you know more about Mordor than you do about Seattle.
Yeah, exactly.
You probably, like, you know.
You can find a 7-Eleven in Mordor.
And a Walmart.
Walmart. That's you beat me to it.
CVS downstream.
Sheldon, I think you hit on something really interesting there about the finite nature of urban fantasy and how that's destined to change, where epic fantasy is much more timeless, and it's kind of drawing back on folklore and myth and things like that, and always referencing that. Well, the urban fantasy, as cities change, by definition also has to change. So how do you think urban fantasy is going to change as we progress going forward?
I'm hoping that our heroines will have their clothes on more.
That's not just for Shannon. If anybody else has thoughts on that too.
Everyone else talk. I'm just happy in my own place.
I really like what Tom's doing with his Remy Chandler novels.
Thank you.
Because he's taken the urban fantasy and he's brought in this noir quality to it. So you're dealing with like angels who are like, you know, Humphrey Bogart. It's really interesting. It's elevated just, you know, something that took place in Los Angeles or in Seattle or New York and made it a genre unto itself. It's an urban noir.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a trend that seems to be expanding, is that hard-edged kind of detective noir mixed with monstrosities and the fantastic.
Yep, Charlie Houston with the vampires, yeah.
Well, I think because urban fantasy tends to be unfairly categorized by its props. You know, if you have this, your urban fantasy, I think the longer it's around, at least the way I hope it goes, is that people do just that, where they go, well, sure, this is the setting, and that makes it urban fantasy, but now let's tell a touching romance story. Because, I mean, there's a difference between paranormal romance and, like, Cyrano de Bergerac. You know, that is a story about romance. You don't necessarily see a lot of skin in that.
Right. Well, the whole core of my first Remy Chandler book is the fact that he's an angel who has been a PI for the last, 60 years or so, and his wife was his secretary, and she's dying of cancer. She's in her late 70s, early 80s, and he's basically adjusting to the fact that people die.
I've got to check this out.
He doesn't really like this, and it's kind of like, maybe I want to be an angel again. Maybe I don't want to be a PI and walk the mean streets of Boston. But the whole point of the story is the fact that the angel of death goes missing, and he's hired to find the angel of death. So to find the angel of death means the death of his wife. Wow. So it's like, what do? Do you do the case, or do you not do the case?
You're way better at the pitch than I am. I can't describe my book to save my life.
I've had a couple of drinks, because I'm normally not that good.
Talking to him about the rules rules and the structure for the urban fantasy, and it works for epic fantasy too. There's a big difference. So how do you go about deciding how much fantasy and how many monsters to inject into the fiction? When does it start to overwhelm people and become just totally unbelievable?
You know, honest to God, it's just like whatever you. As I'm writing, it's literally, oh, that would be cool. I really don't think, we had far too many angels in that scene. Let's subtract 3. No, it's not.
How many angels can dance on the head of your chapter?
That's the second book, Dancing on the Head of a Tower. But yeah,
I just go until my editor tells me, oh no. That was too much.
Yeah, actually, that's probably, when they say, back it up.
No, I tend to really cross over into the horror range pretty solidly with mine. Mine's very dark, sarcastic, grim, and the reason I wanted to write urban fantasy as opposed to something epic was so I could tear mythology down in any way that I wanted without sort of sullying what people had done before us, like Lord of the Rings. So I wanted to move it to a different environment where I could do that. I could tear down mythology, rebuild it. I could be dark and sarcastic, and I could drop as many F-bombs as I wanted to.
Yeah.
I liked what you said earlier about taking the character, stripping away 99% of it, and then using that 1% to build your whole new world and your whole new character. She was great at the panel today at Comic-Con.
Yeah, the other people didn't talk nearly as much. I was like, oh, I can talk all I want there.
Grab that microphone.
But these people are too brilliant. They're just too brilliant for it.
Could you ask that question again? Because I had a great answer and now I can't.
Alright, so how did you go about deciding how much fantasy to inject into the story? When do you have too much magic or too much monsters?
And that's what reminded me of it when you said you wanted to fight against it, but you wanted to go somewhere else. Where I went the other way. I knew I was going to be in the secondary fantasy world, but I wanted to, not to sully Tolkien, because he's what I read growing up, but I did not want to do that thing that has been done 100 times already, and so I made an actual list. I go, okay, elf with we can all sing along to this, right? Elf with a bow, dwarf with an axe. You have an evil sorcerer who's going to destroy the world. A boy and his 4 friends go on a magic quest, prevent Armageddon. They destroy a ring of power or some sort of thing, or find a magic item that will save the world. And faithful animal companion, a prophecy, a chosen one. And so I did all this. I'm like, okay, what is left that you can do? And so a lot of people don't think mine is epic fantasy because there's no goblin army. And he's not saving the world. There's no magic sword. In some ways, there's no magic, according to technical definitions. But I'm still epic fantasy because the book is really thick.
But the challenge is doing all those things that you said not to do. Oh, good Lord. Doing all those things that you didn't want to, I know. Doing all those things and doing them with enough of a spin to make it fresh again.
Yeah, and that's the dangerous part.
That's the beauty. I think that's the fun part. That's the challenge. You know.
And I think the longer epic fantasy exists as its distinct thing, the more people will go, oh, it's not just, vampires and werewolves having sex. They'll go, oh, it's a legitimate vehicle for telling good stories.
So it's not the elf with the bow, it's the elf with the banjo.
I tend to lock down my rules pretty hard, pretty early in, just in terms of the scope of where I'm playing. But that's because, again, I studied folklore, and the quickest way to get the Welsh beat out of your Irish is to conflate those in one-term paper. You've got Tylwyth Teg showing up, and they're like, fail. Okay. So, I sit down, I have biology, I work out 95% of what can show up, even though 2% is going to be in that book. Because that way I never have a werewolf running into the middle of my pixie battle and just being like, look at me! No.
I hate when that happens.
I do hate when that happens. And at 3 in the morning, that seems like the best idea ever. Like, werewolf is in this in 30 seconds. He's an art of death. Let's go. And
Oh, I started backwards. I wanted to write a detective novel. And I said, and wouldn't it be cool if there were ghosts?
Yeah.
And then I thought I didn't want to have to build a whole magical system from scratch, so I took quantum physics